Hey guys, tonight we're trading silk sheets for straw pallets, golden goblets for wooden bowls, and the opulent halls of medieval royalty for the mud-splattered hovels of the people who actually made their world possible. We're diving deep into the brutal, backbreaking, and surprisingly complex reality of medieval peasant life, where survival was an art form, freedom was a luxury, and your social media presence consisted of how loud you could yell across a field. So, before you get comfortable in your climate-controlled room with running water and the ability to order dinner with a few taps on your phone, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me warn you, what we're about to explore might make you reconsider every complaint you've ever had about your Monday morning commute or your Wi-Fi being slow. Let's be clear about something right from the start. When we talk about medieval times, we're not discussing some romantic fairy tale with noble knights and fair maidens. We're talking about roughly 1,000 years of human history, where the vast majority of people, we're talking about 90% of the population, were peasants. These weren't the protagonists of your favorite fantasy novels. These were real people, grinding out existence in a world that seemed designed to crush them at every turn. And yet, here's where it gets interesting. These people weren't just passive victims of their circumstances. They developed intricate social systems, found ways to celebrate and find joy, created art and music, fell in love, raised families, and built communities that would endure for centuries. They were innovators out of necessity, entrepreneurs within impossible constraints, and survivors in the truest sense of the word. To be fair, when most people think about medieval peasants, they picture some Hollywood version. Dirty, toothless, constantly miserable people shuffling around in brown rags, barely human in their wretchedness. That image isn't just wrong, it's lazy. The reality was far more complex, often darker, but also surprisingly nuanced and, in many ways, more human than the caricature suggests. Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of misconception and dive into the actual day-to-day reality of medieval peasant life. We'll explore their homes, their work, their relationships, their beliefs, their struggles, and yes, even their moments of happiness. We'll see how they navigated a world where your birth determined your destiny, where natural disasters could wipe out entire communities, and where the whims of lords could change your life overnight. But here's what might surprise you. We'll also discover people who found ways to game the system, who built surprising wealth within their constraints, who created art that still moves us today, and who developed social bonds that put many modern communities to shame. We'll see how they dealt with everything from plagues to wars to simple, everyday problems, like what to do when your roof leaked and you couldn't afford to fix it. Sound familiar? That's because, stripped of the technology and modern conveniences, many of their fundamental human struggles aren't that different from ours. They worried about money, relationships, health, their children's futures, and whether they were living meaningful lives. The difference is that their margin for error was essentially zero. Over the next 12 sections, we're going to walk through every aspect of peasant existence. We'll start by understanding exactly who these people were and how they fit into medieval society's rigid hierarchy. We'll explore their homes, and I use that term loosely, their work routines that would make modern labor laws weep, their family structures, their diet that would horrify any nutritionist, and their relationship with the land that was simultaneously their salvation and their prison. We'll examine how they dealt with sickness and injury, in a world where a broken leg could be a death sentence, how they found entertainment and meaning in lives that were often brutally short, and how they navigated relationships in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. We'll look at their spiritual lives, their relationship with the church that dominated every aspect of medieval society, and how they faced death, which was never far away. And here's where it gets really interesting. We'll explore how some peasants managed to break free from their circumstances, how the system occasionally worked in their favor, and how their collective actions eventually helped tear down the very feudal system that oppressed them. This isn't going to be a sanitized, feel-good version of history. Medieval peasant life was hard in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. But it also wasn't the one-dimensional misery fest that popular culture often portrays. These were complex human beings living in extraordinary circumstances, and their stories deserve better than the stereotypes they've been saddled with. So buckle up, because we're about to spend some serious time in a world where your biggest worry wasn't student loans or traffic jams, but whether you'd have enough food to survive the winter, whether raiders would burn down your village, or whether the lord of the manor would decide he needed more taxes this year. It's going to be a journey that's equal parts fascinating and sobering, and by the end, you'll never look at a medieval painting or movie the same way again. Ready? Let's step into the mud, sweat, and surprising humanity of medieval peasant life. Let's be honest about medieval society. It was basically a pyramid scheme that lasted for centuries, except instead of selling overpriced supplements, the people at the top were selling the radical idea that God personally wanted them to own everything, while everyone else did the actual work. And unlike modern pyramid schemes, you couldn't even pretend you might work your way to the top. You were born into your slot, and that slot was your destiny until the day you died. Picture this. At the very pinnacle sat the king, supposedly chosen by God himself, which was a convenient arrangement since God wasn't around to dispute the claim. Below him were the great nobles, dukes, earls, and counts, who controlled vast swaths of territory and could field armies that would make small countries nervous. These guys weren't just rich. They were rich enough to build castles for fun and treat warfare as an expensive hobby. Then came the lesser nobles, knights and landed gentry, still wealthy by any reasonable standard, but always looking up at their betters with a mixture of envy and calculated loyalty. They were the middle management of feudalism, responsible for keeping the system running while dreaming of climbing higher. And then, at the bottom of this towering social structure, comprising roughly 90% of the entire population, were the peasants. That's right. 9 out of every 10 people you might have met in medieval Europe were peasants, and their job was fundamentally simple: produce enough food and goods to keep everyone above them living in the style they'd become accustomed to. But here's where it gets interesting. Even among peasants, there was a hierarchy that would make a high school cafeteria look egalitarian. At the top of peasant society were the villeins, who were technically free but bound to the land. They worked. Think of them as medieval mortgage holders, except the mortgage lasted forever and was inherited by their children. They typically held 15 to 30 acres of land, which sounds generous until you realize that medieval farming techniques meant you needed every bit of it just to survive. Villeins had certain rights that separated them from the truly unfortunate. They could own property, make contracts, and even take their lord to court if he violated established customs. Though let's be clear, the medieval legal system wasn't exactly known for its fairness to the little guy. Still, a villain with a good relationship with his lord and some farming skill could live relatively well, at least by medieval standards. Below the villains were the boarders and cotters, smallholders who worked maybe 5 to 10 acres and supplemented their income with crafts or day labor. These people lived on the knife's edge of survival, where a bad harvest or unexpected expense could mean disaster. They were free in name, but often desperate in reality, willing to take on additional obligations to wealthier peasants just to make ends meet. At the absolute bottom of the peasant hierarchy were the serfs. And if you think the word serf sounds uncomfortably close to serf, you're not wrong about the power dynamic. Serfs weren't slaves exactly, but they weren't free either. They belonged to the land, and when the land changed hands, so did they. A serf couldn't leave their lord's estate without permission. couldn't marry without approval, and certainly couldn't choose their profession or change their station in life. Meanwhile, the medieval church added its own delightful twist to this social pyramid. The clergy insisted that this entire arrangement was divinely ordained, that God had specifically designed society to function this way. The nobles ruled and fought, the clergy prayed and administered sacraments, and the peasants worked to support everyone else. Each group had their sacred function, and trying to move between them wasn't just socially inappropriate. It was literally sinful. To be fair, this wasn't just a convenient justification dreamed up by the powerful. Medieval people genuinely believed in a cosmic order where everyone had their proper place and divine purpose. A peasant who tried to rise above his station wasn't just being ambitious. He was disrupting God's plan for the universe. This belief system was so deeply ingrained that many peasants themselves accepted it, finding meaning in the idea that their backbreaking labor was a form of spiritual service. But let's not romanticize this acceptance. The social hierarchy was maintained through a combination of ideology, law, and when necessary, violence. Peasants who got too uppity could find themselves facing everything from economic sanctions to physical punishment. Lords had the right to fine, imprison, or even physically chastise their peasants for various infractions, and the legal system was designed to protect property rights, meaning the lord's rights. Above all else, the economic system reinforced these social divisions at every turn. Peasants owed their lords a bewildering array of obligations: labor service on the lord's domain land, rent for their own plots, taxes on everything from getting married to inheriting property, fees for using the lord's mill or oven, and military service when required. A successful peasant might see 40 to 60% of his production go to meeting these obligations, leaving just enough for his family to survive, and maybe, if he was lucky, save a little for emergencies. And yet, here's where the story gets complicated. Some peasants did manage to thrive within this system. Smart, hardworking, or simply lucky peasants could accumulate land, lend money, and even employ other peasants. By the later medieval period, some peasant families had become quite wealthy, owning multiple holdings and engaging in trade. They remained peasants in legal and social terms, but their economic reality bore little resemblance to the struggling subsistence farmers we often picture. Of course, the system worked both ways. A lord who mismanaged his estates, fell out of favor with his superiors, or simply had bad luck, could find his peasants abandoning him for better opportunities elsewhere. Despite all the legal restrictions, peasants did vote with their feet when conditions became unbearable. Lords who were too harsh, too demanding, or too incompetent could wake up to find their fields empty and their income vanishing. The Black Death of the 14th century turned this entire social order on its head. When a third of the population died, suddenly peasant labor became scarce and valuable. Surviving peasants could demand better terms, higher wages, and more freedom. Lords who had spent centuries taking their workforce for granted suddenly found themselves competing for workers. The result was a series of social upheavals, peasant revolts, and ultimately, the gradual breakdown of the rigid feudal system. Still, for most of the medieval period, the social hierarchy was a fact of life as immutable as the weather. You were born a peasant, you lived as a peasant, and you died as a peasant, hoping that your children might, through hard work and good luck, achieve a slightly better version of peasant life than you had managed. Understanding this social context is crucial because it shaped every aspect of peasant existence. When we explore their homes, their work, their relationships, and their beliefs, we need to remember that all of it took place within a system designed to extract maximum value from their labor while providing them with just enough security and opportunity to keep the whole arrangement running. It was a system that was simultaneously brutal and stable. oppressive and oddly functional, and it defined the lives of the vast majority of medieval Europeans for nearly 1,000 years. If you thought your studio apartment was cramped, let me introduce you to the medieval peasant house, where an entire family, their livestock, and probably a few rodents shared a space smaller than most modern garages. And unlike your apartment, this one came with a leaking roof, no windows, a dirt floor, and the constant, overwhelming aroma of unwashed humans and farm animals, living in uncomfortably close quarters. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. The typical peasant house wasn't the cozy thatched cottage you see in fairy tales, complete with flower gardens and picket fences. It was a single-room structure, maybe 15 by 30 feet if the family was doing well, built from whatever materials were locally available and cheap enough for people living on the edge of subsistence. In most of Europe, this meant walls of wattle and daub, a charming medieval term for sticks covered in mud mixed with animal dung and straw. The construction process itself was a community affair, partly out of necessity and partly because no one person could afford to hire skilled labor. When a peasant family needed a new house, neighbors would gather to help raise the walls and roof in exchange for food, drink, and the understanding that the favor would be returned when needed. The frame was typically made of oak or whatever hardwood was available, with the spaces between the wooden posts filled with woven branches and plastered over with the daub mixture. That's right, medieval peasants literally lived in houses, made partly of cow manure, and before you wrinkle your nose, it was actually an incredibly practical building material. The dung acted as a binding agent and provided surprisingly good insulation, while the straw added structural integrity. Once dried, daub walls were reasonably waterproof and could last for decades if properly maintained. Of course, properly maintained was a luxury many peasant families couldn't afford. The roof presented its own set of challenges and creative solutions. Thatch was the most common roofing material. Layers of straw, reed, or whatever long grass was available, carefully layered and bound to create a waterproof surface. A well-made thatched roof could last 30 to 40 years and provided excellent insulation. The downside? It was basically a giant pile of kindling sitting on top of your house, and medieval houses had a disturbing tendency to burst into flames with little warning. Inside these humble dwellings, space was at an absolute premium, and privacy was a concept that wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. The single room served as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, workshop, and nursery all at once. Furniture was minimal and practical. A table, a few stools or benches, chests for storage, and if the family was prosperous, maybe a bed. Most peasants slept on straw mattresses on the floor, huddled together for warmth under whatever blankets or furs they could afford. And here's where things get really cozy. In many regions, peasant families shared their living space with their livestock. The animals were kept at one end of the house, separated from the human living area by a partition, or sometimes just a designated space. This arrangement, called a longhouse, was practical for several reasons. It protected valuable animals from theft and predators. Their body heat helped warm the house, and in winter, it was easier to care for sick or pregnant animals when they were just a few feet away. To be fair, this setup had some serious drawbacks that went beyond the obvious. Smell issues. Disease could spread rapidly between humans and animals. The house attracted every pest imaginable, and the floor became a challenging landscape of mud, straw, and things you really didn't want to step on. Cleaning was an ongoing battle that the peasants were slowly losing, especially during the wet months when everything turned into a swampy mess. Windows were a luxury most peasant houses simply didn't have. Glass was expensive beyond belief, and even oil, parchment, or linen was a significant expense for families living on subsistence margins. Most peasant houses had at most one or two small openings that could be covered with wooden shutters during bad weather. This meant that medieval peasant houses were dark, stuffy, and filled with smoke from the central fire pit. Yes, the fire pit. The absolute center of peasant domestic life and a source of constant worry. Most peasant houses had a simple fire pit in the center of the main room, with smoke theoretically escaping through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. In practice, this meant that peasant houses were perpetually smoky, which helped preserve food and discourage insects, but also meant that respiratory problems were endemic and everyone's clothes, hair, and possessions were permanently infused with wood smoke. Heating and lighting were ongoing challenges that required constant attention and resources. Firewood was precious, especially in areas where forests were controlled by lords who restricted peasant access. Families had to carefully balance staying warm against conserving fuel, which meant that medieval peasant houses were generally cold, damp, and uncomfortable for much of the year. Lighting came from the fire, occasional candles made from animal fat, and rushlights, basically reeds dipped in grease that provided dim, flickering illumination. The lack of privacy in peasant households had profound implications for family life and social relationships. Children learned about adult matters early. Marriages were consummated within earshot of the entire family, and personal conflicts couldn't be hidden or contained. This forced peasant families to develop social skills and emotional resilience that modern people, with our private bedrooms and personal space, might find difficult to imagine. Storage was another constant challenge. With no closets, pantries, or cabinets, everything had to be kept in chests, hanging from rafters or built into the walls. Food storage was particularly critical. A family's survival through the winter depended on keeping grain preserved, meat and vegetables safe from moisture, pests, and thieves. Many peasant houses had storage areas built into the roof space or underground cellars for this purpose. Meanwhile, the question of sanitation in peasant houses was, well, let's just say that medieval concepts of hygiene were very different from modern ones. Most peasant houses didn't have latrines or any indoor plumbing. Families used chamber pots or simply went outside to designated areas. Water for cooking and cleaning had to be carried from wells, streams, or ponds, making any kind of regular washing a significant chore. Despite all these challenges, peasant families worked hard to make their houses into homes. They decorated their walls with religious images, dried flowers, or simple painted designs. They kept small gardens near their houses for herbs, vegetables, and maybe a few flowers. They maintained family traditions, told stories around the fire, and created spaces that, while humble, were filled with human warmth and connection. As medieval society evolved, so did peasant housing. By the later Middle Ages, more prosperous, peasant families were building two-room houses with a separate kitchen or workshop area. Some even had upper floors or lofts for additional sleeping space and storage. The most successful peasants might own houses that were actually quite comfortable by medieval standards, with glazed windows, stone foundations, and tile roofs. Of course, these improvements came with their own complications. Better houses attracted more attention from tax collectors and local lords, who might decide that a peasant living too well needed to contribute more to their betters. There was a delicate balance between improving one's living conditions and avoiding the kind of visibility that could lead to trouble. The peasant house was more than just shelter. It was the foundation of medieval rural life, the place where families were raised, crafts were practiced, and communities were sustained. It was humble, uncomfortable, and often unhealthy, but it was also the space where the vast majority of medieval Europeans lived, loved, worked, and died. Understanding these homes helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how resourceful people can be when working within severe constraints. If you think your job is demanding, Let me tell you about the medieval peasant work schedule, a delightful routine that started before dawn, continued past sunset, varied dramatically by season, and came with the constant possibility that one bad harvest could literally kill you and your entire family. And the best part? There was no weekend, no paid vacation, and definitely no employee benefits package. The peasants' workday began with the first hint of light, not because they were particularly enthusiastic about their labor, but because daylight was precious and artificial lighting was expensive. A typical peasant family would rise around 4 or 5 a.m., depending on the season, to begin a day that would be packed with essential tasks that couldn't be delayed, postponed, or delegated to someone else. Let's be honest about what work meant. For a medieval peasant, it wasn't a single job with defined responsibilities and regular hours. Peasant families were running complex agricultural operations that required them to be farmers, animal husbanders, craftspeople, maintenance workers, and small business owners all at the same time. A peasant might start the day milking cows, spend the morning plowing fields, dedicate the afternoon to repairing tools, and end the day spinning yarn or weaving cloth. The agricultural calendar dominated everything. Spring meant preparing fields, sowing seeds, and tending to pregnant livestock, work that was physically demanding but filled with hope for the coming harvest. Summer brought the endless cycle of weeding, pest control, and maintaining crops, along with haymaking, which was absolutely crucial for feeding animals through the winter. A peasant family's survival literally depended on cutting, drying, and storing enough hay during the brief summer months when grass was at its peak dot, and then came harvest time, the medieval equivalent of crunch time at a startup. Except, instead of maybe losing your job, failure meant watching your family starve during the winter months. Harvest season was a community-wide emergency where everyone, from small children to elderly grandparents, worked from sunrise to sunset to bring in the grain before weather could destroy it. The margin for error was essentially zero, and peasant families regularly pushed themselves to the point of exhaustion during these critical weeks. But here's where it gets really interesting. Peasants didn't just work their own land. The feudal system meant that they owed labor service to their lord, typically 2 or 3 days per week during peak seasons. This meant that a peasant might spend Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday working his lord's domain land, then rush to his own fields for the remaining days to try to keep his family fed. And if the lord's harvest was behind schedule, guess whose needs took priority? To be fair, the peasant work routine did have some variety that modern office workers might envy. Medieval agriculture required dozens of different skills, from the purely physical work of plowing and harvesting to the technical knowledge needed for animal breeding, food preservation, and craft production. A successful peasant needed to understand soil conditions, weather patterns, plant diseases, animal behavior, and the subtle arts of making everything from bread to beer to candles. The division of labor within peasant families was generally based on practicality rather than rigid gender roles, although certain patterns were common across medieval Europe. Men typically handled the heaviest fieldwork, plowing, harvesting grain, and managing large livestock. Women were usually responsible for the household garden, poultry, dairy production, brewing, and textile work. Children started contributing to family labor as soon as they were physically capable, beginning with simple tasks like gathering eggs or watching animals, and gradually taking on more responsibility. But don't imagine that this was a quaint, pastoral lifestyle where people worked at their own pace in harmony with nature. Peasant labor was brutal, dangerous, and unforgiving. Farming with medieval tools meant that every task required enormous physical effort. Plowing was done with wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses if you were lucky, or by human labor if you weren't. Harvesting grain meant cutting every stalk by hand with a sickle, then beating the grain out of the stalks with flails. Backbreaking work that left hands bloody and bodies aching. Meanwhile, the seasonal nature of agricultural work created its own stresses and challenges. Winter might seem like a slower time, but peasant families used those months for essential maintenance and craft work. Tools needed to be repaired or replaced. Spinning and weaving had to be done to produce cloth for clothing and trade. Buildings required maintenance, and food preservation was an ongoing concern. A peasant who relaxed during the winter months would find himself unprepared for the demands of spring planting. The work was also incredibly dangerous in ways that modern safety regulations would never permit. Peasants regularly worked with large animals that could kick, gore, or trample them without warning. They used sharp tools, worked around open fires, climbed on roofs and in trees, and handled heavy materials with no safety equipment. Agricultural accidents were common and often fatal. A broken leg during harvest season could mean the difference between survival and starvation for an entire family. And yet, peasant communities developed sophisticated systems for managing labor and sharing resources. Cooperative work gangs tackled large projects that were beyond the capacity of individual families. Neighbors helped each other during emergencies, shared expensive tools and equipment, and created informal networks of mutual support that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The work routine also varied significantly based on prosperity and social position within the peasant hierarchy. A villein with 20 to 30 acres and a team of oxen lived a very different life from a cottager with 5 acres and no draft animals. Wealthy peasants could hire laborers during peak seasons, invest in better tools and equipment, and focus on the most profitable aspects of farming. Poor peasants, on the other hand, often had to supplement their agricultural income with craft work, day labor, or seasonal migration to find work on larger farms. Craft specialization added another layer of complexity to peasant work routines. Many peasant families developed skills in particular trades: blacksmithing, carpentry, brewing, milling, or textile production that allowed them to earn additional income and serve their community's needs. A peasant woman who was skilled at brewing might sell ale to her neighbors, while a man with carpentry skills could earn extra income, repairing buildings or making furniture. The integration of agricultural and craft work meant that peasant households were remarkably self-sufficient by modern standards. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, built and maintained their own homes, and produced most of the tools and household goods they needed. This self-sufficiency was born of necessity rather than choice. Commercial goods were expensive and often unavailable, but it meant that peasant families possessed a range of practical skills that would impress modern homesteading enthusiasts. Of course, this self-sufficiency came with its own costs. Peasant families had to master dozens of different skills, maintain extensive knowledge about agriculture and crafts, and work incredibly long hours just to meet their basic needs. There was no specialization, no division of labor that allowed for focused expertise, and no safety net if illness or injury prevented someone from working. The peasant work routine was also shaped by religious obligations and community festivals. The medieval calendar was punctuated by holy days when work was prohibited, harvest festivals that combined celebration with essential labor, and religious observances that provided both spiritual comfort and necessary breaks from the grinding routine of daily survival. Still, for all its hardships, peasant work provided a kind of meaning and connection that many modern jobs lack. Peasants could see the direct results of their labor in the food on their tables, the clothes on their backs, and the homes that sheltered their families. Their work was embedded in seasonal rhythms, community relationships, and traditional practices that connected them to their ancestors and their land. Understanding the peasant work routine helps us appreciate Both the incredible demands placed on medieval rural families and the remarkable skills and resilience they developed in response to those challenges. Let's talk about medieval peasant relationships, where privacy was non-existent. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Marriages were business arrangements, and your extended family wasn't just people you saw on holidays. They were your business partners, your social security system, and quite possibly your only hope of survival when things went sideways. Sound like a nightmare? Welcome to peasant society, where personal space was a luxury no one could afford and emotional independence was a concept that wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. The medieval peasant family was nothing like the nuclear family ideal that dominates modern thinking. Instead, peasant households were complex, multi-generational units that might include parents, children, grandparents, unmarried siblings, distant relatives, servants, apprentices, and anyone else who needed shelter or could contribute to the family's economic survival. Privacy, personal space, individual bedrooms. These were concepts so foreign to peasant life that they might as well have been discussing space travel. Marriage in peasant society was fundamentally an economic transaction, but that doesn't mean it was loveless or purely mercenary. Peasant marriages were typically arranged by families, with careful consideration given to land holdings, work skills, family reputation, and the potential for creating viable economic partnerships. A successful peasant marriage wasn't just about two people getting along. It was about creating a household unit that could successfully navigate the challenges of medieval rural life. Let's be honest about the practical realities here. A peasant woman needed a husband who could handle the heaviest agricultural work, manage livestock, and represent the family in legal and business matters. A peasant man needed a wife who could manage the household, contribute essential skills like brewing, spinning, and food preservation, and help with the endless labor demands of agricultural life. Romantic love was a bonus if it developed, but it wasn't the foundation of peasant marriages. The age of marriage varied considerably depending on economic circumstances and regional customs, but peasant marriages typically occurred later than popular culture suggests. Most peasant women married in their early 20s, men often in their mid-20s, and both partners were usually expected to have accumulated some property or skills before taking on the responsibilities of marriage. This wasn't because medieval people were more mature. It was because establishing a viable household required resources that took time to accumulate. And here's where medieval peasant families get really interesting. They were remarkably pragmatic about adoption, fostering, and flexible family structures. Peasant families regularly took in orphaned relatives, children whose parents couldn't support them, and unrelated individuals who could contribute to the household's economic success. Blood relationships were important, but economic survival was more important. And peasant families were surprisingly willing to expand their definition of family when circumstances required it. Children in peasant families weren't precious, protected beings who spent their days playing and learning. They were economic assets who were expected to contribute to family labor as soon as they were physically capable. A 4-year-old might be responsible for watching geese or gathering eggs, while children of 7 or 8 were helping with planting, weeding, and harvest work. By their teenage years, peasant children were performing adult-level labor and taking on significant responsibilities for family survival. But don't imagine that peasant parents were cold or uncaring. Medieval wills and records show that peasant parents were deeply concerned about their children's welfare and worked hard to provide for their future. The difference was that providing for your children meant teaching them the skills they'd need to survive, arranging advantageous marriages, and, if possible, accumulating enough property to give them a head start in adult life. The extended family network was absolutely crucial for peasant survival, functioning as everything from unemployment insurance to healthcare coverage to business financing. When a peasant family faced disaster, crop failure, illness, death of the primary breadwinner, their extended family was expected to provide support. This wasn't charity. It was an understood obligation that worked both ways. You helped your relatives when they were in trouble because you knew you'd need their help when trouble found you. To be fair, this extensive family network came with its own complications and stresses. Peasant families were involved in each other's lives to a degree that would send modern people running for therapy. Family disputes could escalate into multi-generational feuds. Economic decisions required consensus from multiple family members, and personal choices were subject to family approval or interference. A peasant who wanted to marry someone the family disapproved of, pursue a different trade, or move to a different location faced enormous social pressure and potentially economic disaster. Community relationships in peasant society were equally intense and essential. Medieval villages were small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, strengths, weaknesses, and family history going back generations. Reputation was everything, and social standing was based on a complex mix of economic success, family background, personal behavior, and community contribution. A peasant family's social position could determine everything from their access to common resources to their children's marriage, prospects to their treatment by local authorities. The village community functioned as a collective survival mechanism, with elaborate systems of mutual support, shared resources, and cooperative labor. During harvest time, families helped each other bring in crops. When someone's house burned down, the community came together to help rebuild. When disputes arose, village elders mediated conflicts, according to traditional customs and common sense rather than formal legal procedures. Meanwhile, village social life was surprisingly rich and complex, despite the limited resources and constant work demands. Religious festivals provided opportunities for celebration, courtship, and community bonding. Harvest festivals, weddings, and holy day celebrations were major social events that brought the entire community together. Even daily work often had social components. Women might gather to spin together while sharing gossip and stories. Men might cooperate on large projects while discussing village affairs. Of course, this tight-knit community structure also had its dark sides. Social pressure was intense. Conformity was enforced through gossip and ostracism, and anyone who deviated too far from accepted norms could find themselves excluded from essential community support systems. Village communities could be remarkably cruel to outsiders, people with disabilities, or anyone who challenged established social hierarchies. Gender relationships in peasant society were shaped by practical necessity more than abstract ideals about male and female roles. While medieval society was definitely patriarchal, peasant women had considerable authority within their own spheres, and often wielded significant economic power. A peasant wife was expected to manage complex household enterprises, make important economic decisions, and represent her family's interests in many business matters. Widowed peasant women could and did run successful farms and businesses, own property, and exercise considerable independence. The relationship between peasant families and their social superiors, the local lord, the parish priest, the village officials, was complex and often contradictory. Peasants were expected to show deference and respect to their betters, but they also had traditional rights and customs that even powerful lords were expected to respect. A peasant family with good local connections, a solid reputation, and some economic resources could sometimes successfully challenge unfair treatment or unreasonable demands from their superiors. Children's relationships with their parents were shaped by the practical realities of peasant life, but also showed genuine affection and concern. Parents worked hard to provide for their children's future, often making significant sacrifices to ensure their children had better opportunities. Children were expected to care for aging parents, contributing labor and resources to maintain the family unit across generations. Still, the most remarkable aspect of peasant relationships was their resilience and adaptability. Peasant families and communities survived wars, plagues, famines, and social upheavals by maintaining flexible, supportive relationships that prioritize collective survival over individual desires. They created social bonds that were strong, enough to sustain them through incredible hardships, while remaining adaptable enough to change when circumstances demanded it. Understanding these relationship patterns helps explain how medieval peasant society functioned as effectively as it did despite the enormous challenges it faced. These weren't just personal relationships. They were the social infrastructure that made survival possible in a world where individual isolation meant almost certain death. If you think your diet needs work, let me introduce you to medieval peasant cuisine, a culinary adventure where variety was non-existent. Nutrition was accidental, and your menu was determined entirely by what could grow locally, what you could afford, and most importantly, what wouldn't kill you before next harvest. Welcome to a world where black bread was the height of luxury, vegetables were viewed with suspicion, and a successful meal was one that filled your stomach enough to help you survive until tomorrow. Let's be clear about the medieval peasant diet. It was basically a monotonous rotation of grain-based foods, with occasional additions of whatever else could be scraped together locally. Bread wasn't just the staff of life for medieval peasants. It was life itself. A typical peasant family consumed between 2 and 4 pounds of bread per person per day, which sounds like a lot until you realize that bread was often the only food available and had to provide nearly all their calories and nutrients. But here's the catch. Peasant bread wasn't the fluffy white loaves you grab at the grocery store. Peasant bread was a dense, dark, often gritty substance made from whatever grains were available, which might include barley, oats, rye, and in desperate times, ground peas, beans, or even tree bark and acorns. The bread was so coarse and heavy that it could double as a construction material, and so valuable that stealing bread was a serious crime that could result in severe punishment. The grain hierarchy tells you everything about peasant social status. White bread made from wheat flour was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Most peasants never tasted it in their entire lives. Brown bread made from rye or barley was what better-off peasants might eat occasionally. The poorest peasants ate bread made from mixed grains, often including whatever cheap fillers could be found to stretch the precious flour. During famines, peasant bread might include sawdust, ground roots, or other substances that provided bulk, but little nutrition. To be fair, peasants did eat more than just bread, though not by much. Pottage was the other staple of peasant diet. A thick porridge made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish. Pottage was actually a fairly sensible food for people doing heavy physical labor. It was filling, could be made from whatever ingredients were available, and could simmer all day while the family worked. The downside was that it was basically the same meal every single day, with minor variations depending on what could be added to the pot. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasant families, reserved for special occasions like religious holidays or significant family celebrations. When peasants did eat meat, it was usually pork from pigs they raised themselves, or occasionally poultry from their own chickens. Beef was almost unthinkable. Cattle were far too valuable as work animals to be slaughtered for food, except in emergencies. A peasant family might eat meat a dozen times a year if they were doing well, a few times a year if they were struggling. And here's where the medieval peasant diet gets really interesting from a nutritional standpoint. It was remarkably deficient in almost everything modern nutritionists consider essential. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries that most peasants could rarely afford. The concept of a balanced diet simply didn't exist, and peasant families regularly suffered from scurvy, rickets, anemia, and other nutritional deficiency diseases that are virtually unknown in the modern developed world. Vegetables, when peasants could get them, were usually root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions that could be grown easily and stored through the winter. Peasant families might have small garden plots where they grew cabbage, leeks, peas, and beans, but these were supplements to the grain-based diet, not major food sources. Fresh vegetables during the growing season were a welcome change, but they couldn't be preserved effectively, so peasant families had to make do with dried, pickled, or salted vegetables during the long winter months. Meanwhile, dairy products were more common, but still limited by practical constraints. Peasant families who owned a cow or a few goats could enjoy milk, cheese, and butter, but these were valuable commodities that were often sold rather than consumed by the family. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so it had to be consumed immediately or processed into cheese or butter. Eggs from chickens were another protein source, but again, eggs were valuable trade goods that peasant families often sold rather than ate. The seasonal nature of food production meant that peasant families lived in a constant cycle of feast and famine. Late summer and early fall, after the harvest, were relatively good times when food was most plentiful and varied. Winter was a time of careful rationing and increasingly monotonous meals as stored food supplies dwindled. Spring was the hungry season, when last year's stored grain was running low and new crops hadn't yet matured. Peasant families regularly experienced near starvation during the months before harvest. Food preservation was a matter of life and death for peasant families, and medieval peasants developed impressive skills in smoking, salting, drying, and fermenting foods to make them last through the winter. Meat was smoked or salted, vegetables were pickled or dried. Grain was carefully stored to prevent spoilage and pest damage. A peasant family's survival literally depended on their ability to preserve enough food during the abundant seasons to carry them through the lean months. Of course, food safety was a constant concern in a world without refrigeration or understanding of bacteria. Peasant families regularly ate food that was spoiled, moldy, or contaminated, simply because they couldn't afford to throw it away. Food poisoning was common, and ergot poisoning from contaminated grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The margin between edible and dangerous was thin, and peasant families had to make difficult decisions about when food was too spoiled to eat. Alcohol was actually safer to drink than water in many medieval communities, and peasant families regularly consumed weak ale or wine with their meals. Peasant women often brewed ale at home, both for family consumption and as a source of income. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol content helped preserve the beverage, making it a practical alternative to water that might be contaminated with dangerous microorganisms. But let's not romanticize the peasant diet as some kind of authentic, organic lifestyle. Peasant families ate what they did out of necessity, not choice, and they would have eagerly traded their coarse bread and thin pottage for the varied, nutritious diets that even poor people in developed countries enjoy today. Malnutrition was endemic, childhood stunting was common, and food-related diseases shortened lives and reduced quality of life in ways that are difficult for modern people to imagine. The social aspects of peasant eating were shaped by scarcity and survival needs rather than pleasure or socializing. Mealtimes were brief. Functional affairs focused on consuming enough calories to sustain heavy physical labor. Peasant families ate together out of necessity. They had only one pot, one fire, and limited food that had to be shared carefully among all family members. And yet, peasant communities did find ways to create food traditions and celebrations around their limited resources. Harvest festivals featured special foods and communal meals that brought communities together. Religious holidays were marked by slightly better food, perhaps including meat or special breads. Weddings and funerals were occasions for families to pool resources and create more elaborate meals than anyone could afford individually. The relationship between peasant diet and social status was stark and visible. You could tell a person's place in medieval society by looking at what they ate, how much they ate, and when they ate. Lords and wealthy peasants ate white bread, meat, and varied foods regularly. Poor peasants ate coarse bread, thin pottage, and whatever else they could find. The differences weren't subtle. They were matters of survival. Still, within the constraints of their limited resources, peasant families did develop culinary skills and food traditions that helped them make the most of what they had. They knew how to combine grains and legumes to create more complete proteins, how to use herbs and wild plants to add flavor and nutrition to bland foods, and how to stretch small amounts of expensive ingredients into meals that could feed entire families. Understanding the peasant diet helps us appreciate both the incredible challenges faced by medieval rural families and the resourcefulness they developed in response. Their food may have been monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and often barely sufficient for survival, but it sustained the majority of medieval Europe's population through centuries of agricultural life that laid the foundation for everything that followed. If you think healthcare is expensive now, let me tell you about medieval peasant medicine, where a broken bone could be a death sentence. Surgery was performed by barbers, and the most advanced medical treatment available was prayer combined with herbs that may or may not have been completely useless. Welcome to a world where life expectancy was roughly half of what it is today, where childhood mortality rates would horrify modern parents, and where healthcare consisted mainly of hoping you'd be tough enough to survive whatever was trying to kill you this week. Let's be brutally honest about medieval peasant health. It was a disaster by any modern standard. The average life expectancy for a peasant was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. But that number is misleading because it includes devastating infant mortality rates. If you survived to age 10 as a medieval peasant, you had a decent chance of living into your 50s or even 60s. The catch? A huge percentage of peasant children didn't make it to age 10. Infant and childhood mortality was absolutely staggering. Historians estimate that 30 to 40% of peasant children died before their first birthday, and another 20 to 30% died before reaching adulthood. This means that peasant families regularly experienced the death of children, and parents couldn't afford to become too emotionally attached to babies who might not survive their first year. Having lots of children wasn't just about having help with the farm work. It was about ensuring that some of them would live long enough to take care of you in your old age. The causes of death for medieval peasants read like a catalog of everything that modern medicine has learned to prevent or treat. Infectious diseases were the biggest killers: pneumonia, dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and a host of other bacterial and viral infections that modern antibiotics could clear up in a few days. Without any understanding of germs or sanitation, peasant communities were breeding grounds for disease transmission. And here's where medieval medicine gets really interesting. Most of it was complete nonsense, but some of it actually worked. Through lucky accident or careful observation, medieval physicians believed in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was supposedly caused by imbalances in these humors, and treatment involved trying to restore balance through bloodletting, purging, or dietary changes. This was complete pseudoscience, but occasionally the treatment stumbled onto something that actually helped. To be fair, peasants rarely had access to trained physicians anyway. Doctors were expensive luxuries reserved for the wealthy, and most peasant communities relied on local healers, midwives, and folk medicine practitioners who passed down treatments through oral tradition. Some of these folk remedies were actually effective. Willow bark for pain relief. It contains salicin, similar to aspirin, certain herbs for digestive problems, and honey for wound treatment, which actually has antimicrobial properties. Women played crucial roles in peasant healthcare, serving as midwives, herbalists, and healers for their communities. They attended births, treated injuries, prepared medicinal remedies, and provided most of the medical care that peasant families received. This knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter and was based on centuries of practical experience, observation, and trial and error. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mothers and babies, with maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic today. Women regularly died in childbirth from complications that modern obstetrics could easily handle: hemorrhaging, infections, breech presentations, or simply exhaustion from prolonged labor. Many women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant or recovering from childbirth, which took an enormous toll on their health and contributed to early mortality. Meanwhile, occupational hazards were a constant threat to peasant health and safety. Agricultural work was incredibly dangerous, involving sharp tools, large animals, heavy lifting, and exposure to the elements. Peasants regularly suffered from hernias, back injuries, cuts, crushing injuries, and falls. A broken leg or serious cut that became infected could easily become fatal, and there was no workers' compensation or disability insurance to help families cope with the loss of a primary breadwinner. The medieval peasant diet, as we discussed earlier, was nutritionally inadequate and contributed to widespread health problems. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, rickets from lack of calcium and vitamin D, anemia from iron deficiency, and general malnutrition were endemic in peasant communities. These nutritional deficiencies left peasants vulnerable to infections and made it difficult for them to recover from illnesses or injuries. Mental health was another area where medieval understanding was primitive at best. What we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions were often attributed to demonic possession, moral weakness, or divine punishment. Treatment might involve prayer, exorcism, or simply ignoring the problem until it went away or the person died. The stress of constant survival pressure, frequent loss of family members, and harsh living conditions certainly contributed to mental health problems the peasant communities were ill-equipped to address. And yet, despite all these challenges, medieval peasants developed remarkable resilience and coping strategies. They understood the importance of herbal remedies and developed extensive knowledge about local plants that could treat various ailments. They practiced basic wound care, knew how to set simple fractures, and developed techniques for treating common problems like digestive disorders or skin conditions. Peasant communities also developed social support systems for dealing with illness and disability. When someone became too sick or injured to work, neighbors and extended family members stepped in to help maintain the household and complete essential tasks. This wasn't charity. It was mutual insurance that everyone understood they might meet someday. The role of religion in peasant healthcare was enormous. Prayer was considered one of the most important treatments for any illness, and peasants regularly made pilgrimages to holy sites or sought blessings from religious relics when dealing with serious health problems. While this didn't provide much in the way of actual medical benefit, it did offer psychological comfort and community support that probably helped people cope with illness and recovery. Hygiene and sanitation in peasant communities were poor by modern standards but weren't as terrible as popular culture often suggests. Peasants did bathe, though not as frequently as we would consider normal, and they understood the importance of keeping wounds clean and changing bandages. They just didn't understand the scientific principles behind these practices, so their Efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. The Black Death of the 14th century provides a perfect example of how devastating disease could be for peasant communities. This pandemic killed an estimated one-third of Europe's population, with peasant communities being hit particularly hard due to their poor living conditions and limited resources for dealing with the crisis. Entire villages were depopulated, and the social and economic disruption lasted for generations. But here's what's remarkable about peasant health. Despite all these challenges, people survived, communities endured, and the population generally grew over time. Medieval peasants were tougher, more resilient, and more adaptable than modern. People might imagine they lived with levels of pain, discomfort, and health problems that would send contemporary people rushing to the emergency room, and they did it while maintaining active, productive lives. The knowledge and skills that peasant healers developed weren't just folk wisdom. They represented centuries of careful observation and practical experience. Modern research has validated many traditional remedies, and pharmaceutical companies continue to discover new medicines based on compounds found in plants that medieval peasants used for healing. Of course, the medieval approach to health was also shaped by fatalism and acceptance of suffering that might seem disturbing to modern sensibilities. Peasants understood that life was hard, death was always nearby, and there was little they could do to change these fundamental realities. This acceptance helped them cope with circumstances that would overwhelm people accustomed to modern medical care and safety standards. Understanding peasant health and medicine helps us appreciate both how far medical science has advanced and how resourceful people can be when dealing with health challenges, using limited resources and knowledge. Medieval peasants faced health problems that would terrify modern people, but they developed strategies for survival that sustained their communities through centuries of hardship and gradual improvement. If you think your entertainment options are limited when Netflix goes down, let me introduce you to medieval peasant leisure time. Those precious few hours when the endless cycle of backbreaking labor paused long enough for people to remember that life could include something other than pure survival. Welcome to a world where entertainment was mostly homemade. Leisure time was scarce, and fun had to be squeezed into the brief gaps between work and sleep. Let's be honest about peasant leisure time. There wasn't much of it. When you're working from dawn to dusk, just to keep your family fed and sheltered, recreational activities become a luxury that few can afford. But here's what's fascinating about medieval peasants. Despite their crushing workload and limited resources, they still found ways to create entertainment, celebrate life, and build the social connections that made their harsh existence bearable. The rhythm of peasant entertainment was tied directly to the agricultural calendar and religious observances. Most leisure activities happened during religious holidays, seasonal festivals, or the brief periods between major agricultural tasks, when communities could afford to pause their survival efforts long enough to actually enjoy life. These weren't casual entertainment choices. They were carefully scheduled celebrations that provided essential breaks from the relentless demands of peasant life. Religious festivals were the backbone of peasant entertainment, combining spiritual observance with social celebration in ways that served multiple community needs. Christmas, Easter, Harvest Home, May Day, and dozens of saints' days provided opportunities for peasant communities to come together, share food and drink, and enjoy activities that were otherwise impossible during regular work periods. These festivals weren't just fun. They were social infrastructure that reinforced community bonds and provided psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. Music was probably the most universal form of peasant entertainment, and every peasant community had musicians who could provide accompaniment for dancing, singing, and celebration. Peasant musicians played simple instruments, pipes, drums, fiddles, and crude harps that could be made locally from available materials. The music itself was passed down through oral tradition, with songs that told stories, preserved local history, and provided the soundtrack for community celebrations. Dancing was enormously popular in peasant communities, providing both entertainment and a socially acceptable way for young people to interact and court potential marriage partners. Peasant dances were energetic, communal affairs that involved entire communities and could continue for hours during festival celebrations. These weren't the refined court dances of the nobility. They were vigorous, joyful expressions of community spirit that provided both physical exercise and social bonding. To be fair, peasant entertainment was often rough around the edges by modern standards. Many popular peasant games and sports involved considerable violence and physical risk. Wrestling matches, boxing contests, and various ball games could result in serious injuries, but peasant communities seemed to view this as acceptable entertainment rather than dangerous behavior. The line between sport and combat was often blurry. Storytelling was another crucial form of peasant entertainment, serving as both leisure activity and educational tool. Professional storytellers and traveling minstrels brought news, entertainment, and cultural exchange to isolated peasant communities. Local storytellers preserved community history, shared moral lessons, and provided entertainment during the long winter evenings when other activities were impossible. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the primary way that peasant communities maintained their cultural identity and passed knowledge to the next generation. Drinking was a major component of peasant social life and entertainment, partly because ale and wine were safer than water, but mostly because alcohol provided one of the few escapes from the harsh realities of medieval life. Peasant communities gathered in alehouses at religious festivals and during seasonal celebrations to drink, socialize, and temporarily forget their troubles. Drinking games, singing contests, and various forms of alcohol-fueled entertainment were common features of peasant leisure time. And here's where peasant entertainment gets really interesting. Many activities served multiple purposes beyond simple recreation. Spinning bees brought women together to work on essential textile production while socializing and sharing gossip. Barn-raising parties combined necessary community work with celebration and entertainment. Harvest festivals celebrated the completion of crucial agricultural work while providing social bonding and community reinforcement. Seasonal celebrations were particularly important for peasant communities, marking the passage of time and providing structure for social and economic life. May Day celebrations welcomed spring with dancing, singing, and courtship rituals. Harvest festivals marked the completion of the year's most crucial work with feasting and thanksgiving. Winter celebrations provided light and warmth during the darkest months of the year. Children's entertainment in peasant communities was largely improvised and integrated into adult activities. Peasant children didn't have toys in any modern sense. They played with sticks, stones, and whatever else they could find. Their games were often miniature versions of adult activities, playing house, mock farming, or simple competitions that helped develop the skills they'd need as adults. Child labor was so important to family survival that pure playtime was limited. Meanwhile, peasant communities developed their own forms of competitive entertainment that reflected their agricultural lifestyle. Contests involving strength, skill, or endurance, plowing competitions, archery contests, wrestling matches provided entertainment while showcasing abilities that were valuable in daily life. These competitions also served as informal job markets where skilled workers could demonstrate their abilities to potential employers. The alehouse was the social center of many peasant communities, serving as meeting place, entertainment venue, and informal community center. Alehouses hosted everything from business meetings to wedding celebrations to simple evening socializing. The alehouse keeper, often a woman, was a crucial figure in community social life, providing not just drinks but also news, gossip, and informal mediation of community disputes. Of course, peasant entertainment was also constrained by religious and social authorities who viewed too much fun as potentially dangerous to social order and spiritual welfare. The church regularly denounced various forms of peasant entertainment as sinful or inappropriate, particularly activities that involved gambling, excessive drinking, or behavior that challenged social hierarchies. Local lords also worried about peasant gatherings that might lead to political organization or social unrest. But peasants found ways to work around these restrictions, developing forms of entertainment that were technically acceptable while still providing the social bonding and psychological relief they needed. Religious plays and pageants allowed communities to tell stories and perform while maintaining spiritual respectability. Seasonal festivals combined pagan traditions with Christian observances in ways that satisfied both community needs and religious requirements. The traveling entertainers who visited peasant communities, minstrels, acrobats, storytellers, and various performers provided crucial connections to the wider world beyond the isolated rural villages. These entertainers brought news, new songs and stories, and cultural exchange that helped prevent peasant communities from becoming completely insular. They also provided professional entertainment that was more sophisticated than what local communities could produce on their own. Still, the most remarkable thing about peasant entertainment is how much creativity and joy people could generate with virtually no resources and very little free time. Peasant communities created rich traditions of music, dance, storytelling, and celebration that sustained them through centuries of hardship and provided the cultural foundation for much of what we now consider European folk culture. Games and sports in peasant communities were often violent and chaotic by modern standards, but they served important social functions. Football, for example, was played between entire villages with few rules and no safety regulations. It was basically organized mayhem that could involve hundreds of participants and result in numerous injuries. But these games provided outlets for aggression, opportunities for communities to compete with their neighbors, and entertainment that the entire community could enjoy. Understanding peasant entertainment helps us appreciate both the resourcefulness of medieval communities and the fundamental human need for joy and celebration, even in the most difficult circumstances. Medieval peasants faced challenges that would overwhelm most modern people, but they still found ways to laugh, sing, dance, and celebrate life in whatever brief moments they could steal from the demands of survival. If you think modern people are superstitious, let me introduce you to the medieval peasant worldview, where angels and demons walked among humans, where every natural disaster was divine punishment, where saints could cure diseases, but witches could curse your crops, and where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was so thin it was practically non-existent. Welcome to a universe where everything happened for supernatural reasons, where God was intimately involved in daily life, and where your eternal soul was in constant danger from forces you couldn't see, but definitely needed to fear. Let's be clear about the role of religion in peasant life. It wasn't just what people did on Sundays. Medieval Christianity permeated every aspect of peasant existence, from the moment they woke up until they went to sleep, from birth to death, from personal decisions to community activities. The church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the primary source of education, social services, moral guidance, and cultural identity for medieval peasant communities. The medieval peasant's relationship with God was intensely personal and utterly terrifying at the same time. God was simultaneously a loving father who provided for his children and a wrathful judge who punished sin with disease, famine, and eternal damnation. Peasants lived with the constant awareness that God was watching their every action, thought, and intention, ready to reward virtue or punish wickedness in this life and the next. But here's where medieval peasant religion gets really complicated. It was a fascinating mixture of official Christian doctrine and ancient pagan traditions that had been absorbed, adapted, or simply ignored by the church. Peasant communities maintained beliefs and practices that went back centuries before Christianity arrived in Europe, blending them with Christian theology in ways that would have horrified church authorities if they'd understood what was actually happening in rural communities. The parish priest was supposedly the spiritual guide for peasant communities, but the reality was often quite different. Many parish priests were barely literate, poorly trained, and not much better educated than the peasants they served. Some priests were genuinely dedicated to their spiritual duties, but others were more interested in collecting tithes, enjoying the social privileges of their position, or pursuing relationships that were technically forbidden by their vows of celibacy. To be fair, peasant spirituality included some genuinely beautiful and meaningful elements that provided comfort and hope in difficult circumstances. The veneration of saints created a rich tradition of intercession and protection, where peasants could appeal to specialized heavenly advocates for help with specific problems. Saint Anthony could help find lost objects. Saint Barbara protected against lightning. Saint Christopher watched over travelers. This system gave peasants a sense that they weren't completely powerless against the dangers and uncertainties of life. The religious calendar structured peasant life in ways that went far beyond simple worship. Religious festivals provided the rhythm for community celebrations, agricultural activities, and social events. The timing of planting, harvesting, and other crucial activities was often determined by religious observances rather than purely practical considerations. This integration of spiritual and practical life gave peasants a sense of meaning and purpose that extended beyond mere survival. And yet, peasant religious practices often included elements that would have shocked contemporary church authorities. Many peasant communities maintained beliefs in fairies, spirits, and magical creatures that had nothing to do with official Christian doctrine. They practiced folk magic, used charms and spells for protection and healing, and maintained traditions that were essentially pagan in origin, even when they were given Christian names and explanations. The fear of supernatural evil was a constant presence in peasant life. Demons, witches, evil spirits, and malevolent supernatural forces were believed to be actively working to harm humans through disease, crop failure, livestock death, and personal misfortune. Peasant communities developed elaborate systems of protection against these threats. Holy water, blessed herbs, religious medals, protective prayers, and various folk remedies that were believed to ward off evil influences. Death held a particularly complex place in peasant spirituality. On one hand, death was seen as a natural part of God's plan and a gateway to eternal life for the faithful. On the other hand, it was terrifying because it involved judgment, possible damnation, and unknown terrors of the afterlife. Peasant communities developed elaborate rituals around death and dying that were designed to ensure the safe passage of souls to heaven while protecting the living from supernatural dangers associated with death. The concept of purgatory was especially important for peasant spirituality because it offered hope that souls who weren't quite good enough for immediate admission to heaven could still achieve salvation through prayer, good works, and the intercession of the living. This belief system encouraged peasant communities to maintain ongoing relationships with their deceased family members through prayer, memorial masses, and charitable works performed in memory of the dead. Meanwhile, peasant communities lived in constant awareness of the supernatural world that existed parallel to and intermingled with the physical world. Ghosts were real and regularly interacted with the living. Miraculous events were common and expected. Divine intervention in human affairs was not just possible but routine. This supernatural worldview provided explanations for otherwise inexplicable events, but also created constant anxiety about invisible forces that could affect human life in unpredictable ways. The role of women in peasant spirituality was complex and often contradictory. Women were excluded from official church leadership, but played crucial roles in maintaining folk religious traditions, healing practices, and community spiritual life. Peasant women served as unofficial healers, midwives, and spiritual advisors, often possessing knowledge and skills that were essential for community welfare, but suspect from the perspective of official church doctrine. Confession was a central element of peasant spiritual life that had profound social and psychological implications. The requirement to confess sins to a priest created intimate relationships between peasants and their spiritual advisors, but it also provided church authorities with detailed knowledge about peasant behavior, thoughts, and community activities. The confession system was simultaneously a source of spiritual comfort and a mechanism of social control. Of course, peasant religious observance was also shaped by practical considerations that had nothing to do with spiritual devotion. Church attendance was legally required and socially monitored. Peasants who failed to attend Mass or observe religious holidays could face legal penalties and social ostracism. Religious tithes and fees were significant economic burdens that peasant families had to budget for along with their other survival needs. The pilgrimage tradition provided one of the few opportunities for peasants to travel beyond their immediate communities, visit new places, and experience different cultures and ideas. Pilgrimages to holy sites were believed to provide spiritual benefits, healing miracles, and protection from supernatural dangers. But they were also social adventures that broke the routine of peasant life and provided stories and experiences that could last a lifetime. Still, what's most remarkable about peasant spirituality is how it provided meaning, hope, and community cohesion in circumstances that could easily have led to despair and social breakdown. The medieval peasant worldview might seem primitive or superstitious to modern people, but it offered peasant communities a comprehensive explanation for their experiences, a sense of purpose and meaning, and a social framework that helped them survive and thrive despite incredible challenges. The integration of spiritual and practical life in peasant communities created a holistic worldview where religious faith, agricultural work, family relationships, and community activities were all part of a single coherent system. This integration provided peasant communities with resilience and adaptability that helped them endure centuries of hardship while maintaining their cultural identity and social cohesion. Understanding peasant spirituality helps us appreciate both the power of religious belief to provide comfort and meaning in difficult circumstances, and the ways that folk traditions and official doctrines could blend together to create rich, complex cultural systems that served real human needs even when they weren't entirely consistent or rational by modern standards. If you think the modern legal system is complicated, let me introduce you to medieval peasant law, a delightful maze of competing jurisdictions, ancient customs, religious regulations, and feudal obligations where justice was whatever the local lord decided it was. Legal representation consisted of hoping you had enough friends to back up your story, and trial by combat was still considered a reasonable way to determine guilt or innocence. Welcome to a world where legal rights were privileges that could be revoked at will, where customary law often contradicted written law, and where the phrase "justice is blind" definitely didn't mean what you think it means. Let's be honest about it. Medieval justice from a peasant perspective. It was a system designed by the powerful to maintain their power, with just enough fairness and predictability to prevent total social breakdown. Peasants weren't citizens with rights. They were subjects with obligations, and the legal system existed primarily to ensure those obligations were met while protecting the interests of their social superiors. The complexity of medieval legal jurisdiction would make modern lawyers weep. A single peasant might be subject to royal law, feudal law, church law, local customary law, and guild regulations all at the same time. Determining which court had authority over which matters was an ongoing challenge that even legal experts struggled with. A peasant accused of theft might find himself facing trial in the Lord's manorial court, the royal court, or the church court, depending on the specific circumstances of the crime and the political relationships between competing authorities. Medieval peasants lived under what historians call customary law, a complex web of traditional rights, obligations, and procedures that had evolved over centuries and varied significantly from region to region. These customs weren't written down in legal codes that peasants could consult. They were passed down through oral tradition and interpreted by local authorities who might have their own reasons for remembering customs in particular ways. A peasant's legal rights were only as secure as the local community's memory and the current lord's willingness to respect traditional practices. To be fair, customary law did provide peasant communities with some genuine protections and rights that couldn't be casually ignored. Peasant families had traditional rights to their landholdings that lords were expected to respect. They had rights to use common resources like pastures, forests, and streams according to established customs. They had rights to fair treatment in legal proceedings and protection from arbitrary punishment. The problem was that these rights existed at the pleasure of their social superiors and could be challenged, reinterpreted, or simply ignored when it suited the interests of the powerful. The manorial court was the primary source of legal authority. For most peasant communities, a local court run by the lord of the manor or his representatives that handled everything from property disputes to criminal charges to routine administrative matters. These courts met regularly, often monthly, and were attended by all adult male peasants in the community who served as both jury and witnesses. The proceedings were conducted according to local custom and the lord's interpretation of his legal authority. And here's where medieval peasant justice gets really interesting. It was simultaneously more democratic and more arbitrary than modern legal systems. Peasant men participated directly in legal proceedings as members of the court, providing testimony, serving on juries, and helping to determine appropriate punishments according to local customs. But the final authority rested with the lord or his representative, who could overturn community decisions, impose additional penalties, or simply ignore established procedures when it served his interests. Legal representation, as we understand, it didn't exist for medieval peasants. If you were accused of a crime or involved in a legal dispute, you represented yourself or relied on friends, family members, or respected community members to speak on your behalf. The concept of professional lawyers was reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Peasants had to navigate the legal system using their own knowledge of local customs, their reputation in the community, and whatever social connections they could mobilized on evidence and proof in medieval peasant legal proceedings were based on very different principles from modern legal systems. Physical evidence was less important than witness testimony, community reputation, and various forms of oath-taking. A peasant's word was only as good as his social standing and the number of people willing to swear to his honesty. Character. Witnesses were crucial, and a peasant with a bad reputation or few friends could find himself unable to prove even obvious truths. Trial by ordeal was still practiced in some medieval communities, based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. These ordeals might involve carrying hot iron, plunging hands into boiling water, or being thrown into water to see if you floated, which indicated guilt, or sank, which indicated innocence, though you might drown in the process. These practices were gradually abandoned during the later medieval period, but they illustrate the extent to which medieval justice relied on supernatural intervention rather than rational investigation. Meanwhile, the range of punishments available to medieval courts reflected both the limited resources of peasant communities and the medieval emphasis on public shame and social control. Fines were the most common punishment for minor offenses. Peasants might be required to pay money, livestock, or goods to compensate victims or satisfy court requirements. Public humiliation was also popular. Offenders might be locked in stocks, forced to wear signs describing their crimes, or subjected to ritualized community disapproval. More serious crimes could result in physical punishment that would horrify. Modern sensibilities. Whipping, branding, and mutilation were common penalties for theft, assault, and other significant offenses. The death penalty was reserved for the most serious crimes: murder, treason, repeat offenses, or crimes against church property, and was typically carried out by hanging, though other methods were sometimes used depending on local customs and the nature of the crime. But here's what's fascinating about medieval peasant justice. It was often more concerned with maintaining community harmony and compensating victims than with punishing criminals. Many legal proceedings focused on negotiating settlements that would restore social balance and prevent ongoing conflicts. A peasant who stole from his neighbor might be required to pay compensation, perform public service, or make amends in ways that satisfied both the victim and the community. Property disputes were a constant feature of peasant legal life, partly because land boundaries were often unclear, and partly because peasant families were constantly trying to improve their economic position through land acquisition. These disputes could drag on for years, involving multiple generations and complex questions of inheritance, customary rights, and lord's authority. A successful peasant needed to be as skilled at legal maneuvering as he was at farming. Debt collection was another major source of legal activity in peasant communities. Medieval peasants regularly borrowed money, goods, or services from each other, creating complex webs of mutual obligation that sometimes led to disputes. The legal system provided mechanisms for collecting debts, but it also protected debtors from completely losing their means of survival. A peasant's basic farming equipment, animals, and shelter were typically protected from seizure, even when he couldn't pay his debts. Of course, the medieval legal system was heavily biased in favor of men, property owners, and social superiors. Women had limited legal rights and were often required to have male representatives speak for them in legal proceedings. Poor peasants faced significant disadvantages when dealing with wealthier community members or social superiors. The entire system was designed to maintain existing power relationships rather than to provide equal justice. The church courts represented a parallel legal system that handled matters involving religious law, marriage, inheritance, and moral behavior. Church courts could impose spiritual penalties like excommunication or require penance for various offenses. They also handled disputes involving tithes, church property, and the behavior of church officials. Peasants sometimes found themselves caught between competing jurisdictions when church law and secular law conflicted. Criminal behavior in peasant communities was often handled through informal social pressure and community intervention before formal legal proceedings became necessary. Peasant communities were small, tightly knit groups where everyone knew everyone else's business. Social ostracism, gossip, and community disapproval were powerful tools for controlling behavior and maintaining social order. Formal legal action was often a last resort when informal mechanisms failed. Still, what's remarkable about medieval peasant legal life is how it provided a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining social order in communities that lacked modern police forces, professional legal systems, or centralized government authority. The combination of customary law, community participation, and lord's authority created a system that was arbitrary and unfair by modern standards, but functional enough to sustain medieval rural society for centuries The evolution of peasant. Legal rights over time reflects broader changes in medieval society and the gradual development of more sophisticated legal systems. By the later Middle Ages, peasants had gained more legal protections, clearer property rights, and better access to royal courts that could override local arbitrary authority. These changes were often the result of peasant resistance, economic development, and the need for more stable legal frameworks to support increasingly complex rural economies. Understanding medieval peasant legal life helps us appreciate both the challenges faced by people living under arbitrary authority and the ways that communities can create functional legal systems even when formal institutions are weak or biased. Medieval peasants navigated a complex legal landscape that required considerable skill, social knowledge, and political awareness, demonstrating human adaptability and the universal need for predictable rules and fair procedures. If you think social mobility is tough today, let me tell you about medieval peasant attempts to climb the social ladder, where your birth determined your destiny. Changing your social class was literally sinful, and yet somehow some clever, lucky, or determined peasants managed to claw their way out of the fields and into better lives. Welcome to a world where social mobility was theoretically impossible, but practically achievable for those who were smart enough to game the system, tough enough to survive the risks, and fortunate enough to catch the right breaks. Let's be clear about the medieval attitude towards social mobility. The entire social system was based on the idea that God had assigned everyone their proper place in society, and trying to rise above that place was not just ambitious, it was blasphemous. The Church taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained. The nobility insisted that breeding and bloodlines determined capability, and the legal system was designed to keep everyone locked in their assigned social position. And yet, despite all these obstacles, medieval Europe was actually more socially mobile than the ideology suggested. The most common path for peasant social advancement was through the Church, which offered one of the few legitimate ways for talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise in medieval society. A peasant boy who showed intelligence and religious dedication could potentially become a priest, and from there, rise through the church hierarchy to positions of genuine power and influence. Some peasant sons became bishops, abbots, or even cardinals, wielding more real authority than many nobles. But here's the catch with church advancement. It required giving up family life, accepting celibacy, at least officially, and navigating a complex institutional hierarchy that was often more interested in political connections than spiritual merit. A peasant seeking advancement through the church needed to find a sponsor, typically a local lord or existing church official, who would support his education and early career. This created relationships of dependence that could limit the independence that advancement was supposed to provide. Military service offered another potential path upward, though it was incredibly dangerous and success was far from guaranteed. A peasant with exceptional fighting skills might catch the attention of a lord who needed reliable soldiers. Successful peasant soldiers could be rewarded with land grants, elevated to minor noble status, or given positions of authority within military organizations. The 100 Years' War and various other conflicts created opportunities for social advancement through military prowess that might not have existed during peacetime. To be fair, military advancement usually meant starting at the bottom and working your way up through years of dangerous service. A peasant soldier might begin as a common foot soldier, advance to become a sergeant or captain, and eventually, if he was exceptionally successful and lucky, be granted land or title by a grateful lord. But for every peasant who achieved this kind of success, hundreds died in battle or returned home broken and impoverished. Commerce and trade provided increasingly important opportunities for peasant advancement, especially in the later medieval period when economic growth created new possibilities for wealth accumulation. Peasant families who developed skills in particular crafts, accumulated capital for trade ventures, or managed to position themselves in growing markets could sometimes achieve substantial wealth and social status. The rise of towns and cities created new economic opportunities that didn't exist in purely agricultural societies. And here's where peasant economic advancement gets really interesting. Some peasants became quite wealthy while remaining technically peasants in legal and social terms. A successful peasant might own multiple landholdings, employ other peasants, lend money at interest, and live more comfortably than many minor nobles. These wealthy peasants occupied an ambiguous social position that challenged traditional categories and created tensions within the established social order. The wool trade in medieval England provides excellent examples of peasant families who achieved remarkable success through commercial enterprise. Some peasant families accumulated enough capital to become wool merchants, dealing directly with international buyers and developing business networks that spanned Europe. These merchant families often invested their profits in land acquisition, eventually becoming landed gentry who were socially indistinguishable from minor nobility. Education, when peasants could access it, was a powerful tool for social advancement. A peasant who learned to read, write, and calculate could find employment as a clerk, scribe, or administrator for wealthy individuals or institutions. These positions provided steady income, social respectability, and opportunities to develop the skills and connections needed for further advancement. Some peasant families invested heavily in educating their children, viewing literacy as the key to escaping agricultural life. Meanwhile, the rise of universities during the later medieval period created new possibilities for peasant advancement through intellectual achievement. A brilliant peasant boy could potentially earn a university education, become a scholar or administrator, and rise to positions of influence within academic, religious, or government institutions. This path required exceptional ability and considerable luck, but it was possible for those who could access it. Marriage was another traditional avenue for social advancement, though it worked differently for men and women. A peasant woman with exceptional beauty, skills, or family connections might attract the attention of a man from a higher social class. A peasant man who distinguished himself through military service, commercial success, or other achievements might be able to marry into a family of higher social status. These marriages could provide the connections and resources needed for further advancement. Of course, the risks associated with attempting social mobility were enormous. Peasants who tried to rise above their station often faced hostility from both their original social class and the class they were trying to join. They might be rejected by their peasant community for putting on airs while being looked down upon by their social superiors as upstarts who didn't know their proper place. Failed attempts at advancement could result in financial ruin, social ostracism, or even legal punishment. The Black Death of the 14th century created unprecedented opportunities for peasant advancement by dramatically reducing the population and creating labor shortages that gave surviving peasants more bargaining power. Some peasant families were able to accumulate the landholdings of plague victims, demand higher wages for their labor, or move to areas with better opportunities. The social disruption caused by the pandemic temporarily weakened traditional social barriers and allowed for more mobility than had been possible in earlier centuries. But let's not romanticize medieval social mobility. It remained extremely difficult and was achieved by only a small percentage of peasant families. Most peasants lived and died in the same social position they were born into, and their children faced the same limited opportunities. The success stories are remarkable precisely because they were so unusual in a society designed to prevent this kind of advancement. Regional variations in social mobility were significant. with some areas of Europe offering more opportunities than others. Italian city-states, Flemish commercial centers, and English wool-producing regions provided more possibilities for peasant advancement than isolated agricultural areas with traditional social structures. Peasant families sometimes migrated to take advantage of better opportunities, though this meant giving up the security and social connections of their home communities. Still, what's most interesting about peasant social mobility is how it demonstrates human ambition and adaptability in the face of enormous structural obstacles. Medieval peasants who achieved advancement had to be intelligent, hardworking, politically astute, and incredibly persistent. They had to navigate complex social hierarchies, economic challenges, and cultural barriers that would have discouraged less determined individuals. The stories of successful peasant families also reveal the importance of multi-generational planning and investment. Social advancement rarely happened within a single lifetime. It typically required several generations of careful accumulation, strategic marriages, and gradual improvement of social position. Peasant families who achieved long-term success often did so by playing a long game that spanned decades or centuries. Understanding peasant social mobility helps us appreciate both the constraints of medieval social structure and the human capacity for overcoming those constraints through determination, skill, and strategic thinking. Medieval peasants faced social barriers that seem almost insurmountable, but some of them found ways to transcend their circumstances and create better lives for themselves and their descendants. The successful peasant families who achieved social advancement also contributed to the gradual transformation of medieval society, challenging rigid social categories and demonstrating that ability and achievement could sometimes triumph over birth and breeding. Their stories provide inspiration and insight into the complex dynamics of social change in pre-modern societies. If you think your schedule is tied to deadlines, let me introduce you to the medieval peasant calendar, where missing a planting deadline could mean starvation, where weather wasn't just an inconvenience but a matter of life and death, and where natural disasters could wipe out years of hard work in a matter of hours. Welcome to a world where human survival was completely dependent on natural cycles, where climate change meant the difference between abundance and famine, and where peasant families lived in constant awareness that they were just one bad harvest away from disaster. The medieval agricultural year was a precisely choreographed dance between human effort and natural forces, where every season brought specific challenges and opportunities that couldn't be delayed, postponed, or rescheduled. Peasant families planned their entire lives around this agricultural calendar, and their survival depended on their ability to complete essential tasks within narrow time windows determined by weather patterns, soil conditions, and plant biology. Let's be honest about what the agricultural calendar meant for peasant life. It was a relentless cycle of backbreaking work punctuated by brief periods of relative rest, with no room for error and constant anxiety about factors completely beyond human control. A peasant family's entire year was structured around the demands of farming and every other aspect of their lives. Social activities, religious observances, family planning, and economic decisions had to be arranged around the non-negotiable requirements of agricultural production. Spring was simultaneously the season of hope and terror for peasant families. The end of winter meant survival through the hungry months when stored food was running low and new crops hadn't yet matured. But spring also brought the crucial planting season, when peasant families had to prepare fields, sow seeds, and complete dozens of essential tasks within a few short weeks. Weather delays during planting season could reduce crop yields by enough to mean the difference between sufficiency and starvation. The spring plowing was one of the most physically demanding and technically challenging aspects of peasant agriculture. Using wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses, Peasant families had to break up soil that had been compacted by winter weather, remove stones and debris, and create seedbeds that would give their crops the best possible chance of success. This work required enormous physical strength, considerable skill, and careful coordination between humans and draft animals. To be fair, spring also brought renewal and optimism that helped peasant families recover from the hardships of winter. The return of fresh food from kitchen gardens, the birth of new livestock, and the promise of the coming harvest provided psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. Spring festivals and religious celebrations marked the return of life and growth, giving peasant communities opportunities to come together and celebrate their survival through another winter. Summer was the season of constant vigilance and endless labor, when peasant families fought an ongoing battle against weeds, pests, plant diseases, and weather extremes that could destroy their crops. This wasn't the leisurely summer of modern imagination. It was a period of relentless work where every day brought new challenges that required immediate attention. Crops had to be weeded regularly, animals needed constant care, and hay had to be cut and stored during the brief window when weather conditions were right. The haymaking season was particularly crucial and stressful, requiring peasant families to cut, dry, and store enough grass to feed their livestock through the winter months. This work was completely dependent on weather conditions. Hay had to be cut during dry periods and stored before rain could spoil it. A peasant family that failed to make enough hay or lost their hay crop to bad weather faced the prospect of watching their animals starve during the winter. And here's where the medieval agricultural calendar gets really dramatic. Harvest season was the climax of the entire year, when all the work, planning, and hoping of the previous months came together in a few crucial weeks that determined whether the family would survive the coming winter. Harvest was a community-wide emergency where everyone, from small children to elderly grandparents, worked from sunrise to sunset to bring in the grain before weather could destroy it. The harvest season was also incredibly dangerous and stressful. Grain had to be cut by hand using sickles, loaded onto carts, and transported to storage areas where it could be threshed and processed. This work was physically exhausting and required careful timing. Grain that was harvested too early wouldn't store properly, while grain left too long in the fields could be destroyed by storms, eaten by pests, or ruined by early frost. Meanwhile, peasant families were acutely aware that their entire survival for the next year depended on the success of these few weeks. A good harvest meant adequate food, the ability to pay taxes and rents, and perhaps even a small surplus that could be sold or saved. A poor harvest meant hunger, debt, inability to meet obligations, and the constant specter of starvation during the coming winter months. Autumn brought both relief and new anxieties as peasant families completed their harvest and began preparing for winter. This was the time for processing and preserving food, making final repairs to buildings and equipment, and taking stock of resources that would have to last through the cold months. Autumn was also the time for paying taxes, rents, and feudal obligations, payments that were based on harvest yields and could consume a large percentage of a family's production. The autumn slaughter was a crucial but emotionally difficult time when peasant families killed livestock that they couldn't afford to feed through the winter. This provided fresh meat that had to be preserved through smoking, salting, or other techniques. But it also meant the loss of valuable animals that represented wealth, security, and future breeding potential. Deciding which animals to keep and which to slaughter required careful calculation and considerable emotional strength. Winter was theoretically the quietest season in the agricultural calendar. But peasant families used this time for essential maintenance, craft production, and preparation for the coming year. Tools had to be repaired or replaced. Buildings needed maintenance. Spinning and weaving provided cloth for clothing and trade. and food preservation required constant attention. Winter was also the time when peasant families were most vulnerable to hunger, cold, and disease. But let's talk about what really made the agricultural calendar terrifying for medieval peasants. Natural disasters that could destroy years of work and threaten entire communities with starvation. Droughts, floods, early frosts, hailstorms, plant diseases, and pest infestations were constant threats that peasant families couldn't predict, prevent, or control. A single bad weather event at the wrong time could reduce crop yields by enough to create famine conditions. Not the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 provides a perfect example of how natural disasters could devastate peasant communities. Several years of unusually cold and wet weather destroyed crops across northern Europe, creating widespread hunger that lasted for years and killed an estimated 10 to 15% of the population. Peasant families faced impossible choices between feeding their children and saving seed grain for the next year's planting. Climate variations that seem minor by modern standards could have devastating effects on peasant agriculture. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 AD, allowed peasant communities to expand agriculture into marginal areas and support larger populations. But the subsequent cooling period, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, made these marginal areas unsuitable for farming and forced peasant communities to abandon settlements that had been successful for generations. Of course, peasant communities developed sophisticated strategies for managing agricultural risks and surviving natural disasters. Crop diversification helped ensure that the failure of one crop wouldn't mean total disaster. Food storage techniques allowed families to maintain reserves that could carry them through bad years. Community cooperation systems provided mutual support during emergencies. Traditional knowledge about weather patterns, soil conditions, and plant behavior helped peasants make better decisions about timing and techniques. Still, the most remarkable thing about the medieval agricultural calendar is how it shaped every aspect of peasant culture, from religious observances to social relationships to economic planning. Peasant communities developed rich traditions of seasonal celebrations, work songs, and folk wisdom that helped them navigate the challenges of agricultural life while maintaining their cultural identity and community cohesion. Understanding the agricultural calendar and its relationship to natural disasters helps us appreciate both the vulnerability of pre-modern communities to environmental challenges and the remarkable resilience and adaptability that allowed them to survive and thrive. Despite those challenges, medieval peasants lived with levels of uncertainty and environmental risk that would be unimaginable to most modern people. But they developed strategies and cultural systems that sustained their communities through centuries of agricultural life. If you think social revolutions happen overnight, let me tell you about the gradual transformation that medieval peasants orchestrated over centuries, not through dramatic uprisings or grand political movements, but through countless individual decisions, economic innovations, and quiet acts of resistance that slowly but inexorably dismantled the very feudal system that had oppressed them for generations. Welcome to one of history's most underrated revolutions, where the people at the bottom of society managed to reshape the entire medieval world simply by refusing to accept that their assigned place was permanent. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. The transformation of medieval peasant life wasn't a single event or even a series of dramatic changes that historians can point to and say, this is when everything shifted. Instead, it was a gradual evolution that took place over several centuries, driven by demographic changes, economic development, technological innovations, and the accumulated effects of countless peasant families making small improvements to their circumstances. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 serves as the most dramatic catalyst for peasant transformation. But it's important to understand that the pandemic accelerated changes that were already underway rather than creating entirely new dynamics. The plague killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, creating labor shortages that fundamentally altered the relationship between peasants and their social superiors. Suddenly, peasant labor became scarce and valuable, giving surviving peasants bargaining power they had never possessed before. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Peasant communities didn't just passively benefit from these changed circumstances. They actively seized opportunities to improve their positions, demand better terms from their lords, and create new economic arrangements that gave them more autonomy and prosperity. Peasant families abandoned unproductive lands for better opportunities, negotiated higher wages for their labor, and refused to accept traditional obligations that no longer served their interests. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England provides a perfect example of how medieval peasants could organize sophisticated resistance movements when their grievances reached the breaking point. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion of peasant anger. It was a coordinated uprising that involved thousands of peasants across multiple counties, with clear political demands and organizational structures that challenged the entire feudal system. To be fair, the 1381 revolt was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving its immediate political goals, and many of its leaders were executed or punished severely. But the revolt demonstrated that peasants were capable of complex political thinking, sophisticated organization, and direct action against the powers that oppressed them. More importantly, it forced English authorities to recognize that peasant discontent was a serious political issue that couldn't be ignored or suppressed indefinitely. Similar peasant uprisings occurred across medieval Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. The Jacquerie in France, various German peasant revolts, and numerous smaller disturbances that reflected growing peasant confidence and organizational capability. These revolts shared common themes: demands for reduced feudal obligations, complaints about taxation and legal oppression, and assertions of peasant rights that challenged traditional social hierarchies. Meanwhile, the gradual monetization of the medieval economy created new opportunities for peasant advancement that hadn't existed in earlier centuries. As money became more important than land-based obligations, peasant families could accumulate wealth through trade, craft production, and agricultural innovation. Some peasants became remarkably prosperous, accumulating enough capital to purchase land, lend money, and employ other peasants. The growth of towns and cities during the later medieval period provided peasants with alternatives to agricultural life that had previously been unavailable. Urban areas needed workers for manufacturing, construction, and commerce, creating opportunities for peasants to escape rural poverty and feudal obligations. The famous medieval saying, "City air makes free," reflected the reality that peasants who could establish themselves in urban communities often gained legal freedom and economic opportunities that were impossible in rural areas. And yet, the transformation of peasant life wasn't just about escape from rural conditions. It was also about improving conditions within agricultural communities. Peasant families developed more sophisticated farming techniques, introduced new crops and livestock breeds, and created more efficient systems for managing agricultural production. These innovations increased productivity and allowed some peasant communities to achieve levels of prosperity that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. The development of regional and international markets for agricultural products gave successful peasant farmers new opportunities to profit from their production. Peasant families in areas with advantageous geographic positions or favorable growing conditions could specialize in particular crops or livestock products and sell to distant markets. The English wool trade, Flemish grain production, and various regional specialties allowed some peasant communities to achieve remarkable prosperity. Of course, These economic opportunities were accompanied by new risks and uncertainties that peasant families had to navigate carefully. Market-oriented agriculture meant that peasant families became vulnerable to price fluctuations, harvest failures, and economic disruptions that were beyond their control. Some peasant families who had prospered during good times found themselves bankrupt when markets shifted or disaster struck. The relationship between peasants and their social superiors also evolved significantly during the later medieval period. Lords who had once relied on forced labor and feudal obligations increasingly found it more profitable to rent their lands to peasant tenants, who could pay cash rents and manage agricultural production independently. This shift created a class of peasant farmers who were essentially agricultural entrepreneurs, making their own production decisions and bearing the risks and benefits of their choices. Still, what's most remarkable about the transformation of medieval peasant life is how it contributed to broader changes in European society and culture. The economic innovations developed by peasant communities, improved agricultural techniques, more efficient production systems, and new forms of rural organization provided the foundation for the agricultural revolution that would later support industrialization and urbanization. The political consciousness that peasants developed through their struggles against feudal oppression contributed to broader movements toward more representative government and individual rights. The peasant revolts of the 14th and 15th centuries helped establish precedents for popular resistance to arbitrary authority that would influence later democratic movements. The cultural changes that occurred in peasant communities during the later medieval period, increased literacy, greater geographic mobility, and more complex economic relationships, helped create the social conditions that would support the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. Peasant communities that had been isolated and culturally static for centuries became more connected to broader European cultural developments. But let's not romanticize this transformation or pretend that it was easy or inevitable. The changes that improved peasant life took centuries to develop and came at enormous cost in human suffering. Thousands of peasants died in failed revolts, economic experiments that didn't work, and social changes that destroyed traditional communities without immediately providing better alternatives. The transition from feudal to more modern economic and social systems created winners and losers within peasant communities. Some peasant families were able to take advantage of new opportunities and achieve remarkable success, while others were displaced by economic changes they couldn't adapt to or control. The transformation of medieval agriculture destroyed some traditional ways of life while creating new possibilities that not everyone could access. Regional variations in the pace and character of peasant transformation were enormous. Some areas of Europe experienced rapid changes that dramatically improved peasant conditions, while others remained locked in traditional feudal relationships well into the early modern period. Italian city-states, Flemish commercial regions, and English agricultural areas led the way in peasant advancement, while more isolated or politically conservative regions lagged behind. The role of technological innovation in peasant transformation cannot be underestimated. Improvements in agricultural tools, new crops introduced from other regions, better techniques for food preservation and processing, and innovations in transportation and communication all contributed to peasant prosperity and autonomy. These technological changes often originated in peasant communities themselves, developed by practical people solving everyday problems. The demographic changes that occurred during the later medieval period, population recovery after the Black Death, internal migration and urbanization created new social dynamics that peasant communities had to navigate. Some peasant families found themselves in advantageous positions as population patterns shifted, while others were forced to adapt to changing labor markets and social conditions. Meanwhile, the educational changes that gradually reached peasant communities during this period had profound long-term implications for peasant advancement. As literacy became more common and practical education became more available, peasant families could participate more effectively in commercial activities, legal proceedings, and political movements. Education became a tool for peasant advancement that complemented traditional strategies based on land accumulation and agricultural skill. The religious changes that swept through late medieval Europe, the rise of popular religious movements, criticism of church corruption, and demands for religious reform often found strong support in peasant communities. Peasants who had developed political consciousness through their struggles against feudal oppression were receptive to religious messages that challenged established authority and emphasized individual spiritual responsibility. Of course, the transformation of peasant life also created new forms of social stratification and inequality within rural communities. As some peasant families achieved prosperity and others remained mired in poverty, medieval rural society became more complex and economically differentiated. Successful peasant families often employed poorer neighbors, creating new forms of economic dependence that replaced older, feudal relationships. The legal changes that accompanied peasant transformation, clearer property rights, more accessible courts, and better protections against arbitrary authority, reflected broader shifts in medieval political and social organization. Peasant communities played important roles in developing and defending these legal innovations, often through collective action and organized resistance to traditional authorities. Still, perhaps the most important aspect of peasant transformation was how it demonstrated the potential for ordinary people to reshape their circumstances through sustained effort, collective action, and intelligent adaptation to changing conditions. Medieval peasants who had been dismissed as ignorant, passive, and incapable of improvement proved that they could innovate, organize, and achieve remarkable social and economic advancement when circumstances permitted. Understanding how medieval peasant life transformed European society helps us appreciate both the power of gradual social change and the importance of providing opportunities for advancement to people at all levels of society. The medieval peasants who slowly dismantled feudalism through their individual and collective choices created precedents and possibilities that would influence European development for centuries to come. Their story reminds us that social progress often happens through the accumulated effects of countless small changes rather than dramatic revolutionary moments, and that people who seem powerless within existing systems often possess the knowledge, skills, and determination needed to create better alternatives when the opportunity arises. If you think medieval peasant communities were peaceful havens of rural cooperation, let me introduce you to the darker reality of village life, where domestic violence was considered normal, where disputes over property could escalate into blood feuds lasting generations, and where the thin veneer of community solidarity often masked brutal competition for scarce resources. Welcome to the medieval countryside, where life was cheap, justice was rough, and your neighbors might be just as dangerous as the bandits hiding in the local forest. Let's be honest about violence in peasant communities. It was endemic, accepted, and often the primary way that social conflicts were resolved. Medieval peasants lived in a world where physical force was a normal part of daily life, where wife-beating was considered a husband's right and responsibility, and where settling disputes through violence was more common than seeking legal remediation. The same harsh conditions that created strong community bonds also generated intense conflicts that could turn deadly with little warning. Domestic violence within peasant households was so routine that it barely registered as noteworthy in medieval records. Husbands were expected to physically discipline their wives. Parents regularly beat their children, and household servants could be punished with violence for minor infractions. This wasn't considered abuse. It was considered proper household management, sanctioned by law, custom, and religious doctrine. To be fair, this acceptance of domestic violence reflected broader medieval attitudes about hierarchy, authority, and social control that extended far beyond peasant communities. But the combination of harsh living conditions, alcohol consumption, and the stress of constant survival pressure made peasant households particularly volatile places where violence could erupt over seemingly minor disputes. Property disputes in peasant communities could escalate into conflicts that consumed entire families and lasted for decades. A disagreement over land boundaries, inheritance rights, or damage to crops could spiral into ongoing feuds involving extended families, neighbors, and sometimes entire villages. These conflicts were often resolved through violence, theft, and revenge rather than legal proceedings, creating cycles of retaliation that could persist across generations. Meanwhile, crime within peasant communities was surprisingly common, though it often went unreported or was handled through informal community justice rather than official legal procedures. Theft was endemic. Peasants regularly stole from each other, from their lords, and from the church. Livestock theft was particularly common and particularly dangerous, since animals represented significant wealth that could be easily moved and difficult to trace. And yet, the most disturbing aspect of peasant violence wasn't the everyday brutality of domestic disputes or property conflicts, but the periodic explosions of community rage that could target outsiders, minorities, or anyone who violated community norms. Peasant communities were capable of shocking cruelty toward people they perceived as threats to their survival or social order. Jewish communities, traveling merchants, suspected witches, and religious minorities could face mob violence that was swift, brutal, and utterly remorseless. Of course, this violence was often a product of the desperate circumstances in which peasant communities found themselves, when survival was always uncertain and resources were always scarce. Communities developed harsh mechanisms for protecting what little they had and punishing anyone who threatened their security. Violence wasn't just about settling disputes. It was about enforcing social boundaries and maintaining group solidarity in the face of external threats. Still, understanding the violence that permeated peasant life helps complete our picture of medieval rural society. These weren't gentlefolk living in harmony with nature and each other. They were tough, often brutal people who had learned that violence was sometimes the only language that others understood, and that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford when their family survival was at stake. So there we have it, the complete, unvarnished reality of medieval peasant life, stripped of romantic fantasies and Hollywood nonsense. We've walked through mud-floored houses that doubled as barns, sweated through harvest seasons where failure meant starvation, navigated social hierarchies that made prison systems look flexible, and somehow discovered that the people at the bottom of medieval society were far more complex, resilient, and human than the stereotypes suggest. Let's be honest about what we've learned here. Medieval peasant life was brutal in ways that would break most modern people within weeks. These weren't the quaint country folk of fairy tales, living in harmony with nature and finding joy in simple pleasures. They were people grinding out existence under conditions that combined backbreaking physical labor, constant insecurity, minimal nutrition, primitive medical care, and social constraints that made upward mobility nearly impossible. And yet, here's what makes their stories so compelling. They weren't just passive victims of their circumstances. Medieval peasants created rich cultural traditions, built lasting communities, developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, found ways to celebrate and find meaning in harsh lives, and occasionally managed to transcend the limitations of their social position through intelligence, determination, or sheer luck. To be fair, We shouldn't romanticize their struggles or pretend that their suffering was somehow noble or meaningful, in ways that modern hardships aren't. Peasant families watched their children die from diseases that are now easily preventable. They worked themselves to exhaustion in conditions that would violate every modern labor law. They lived with levels of uncertainty about basic survival that most of us can't even imagine. But understanding peasant life helps us appreciate several important truths about human nature and historical development. First, people are remarkably adaptable and can create meaningful lives even under incredibly difficult circumstances. Medieval peasants found ways to laugh, love, celebrate, and maintain hope despite facing challenges that would overwhelm many modern communities. Second, social and economic systems that seem stable and permanent are actually fragile and subject to change. The feudal system that oppressed medieval peasants for centuries eventually collapsed, partly because of peasant resistance, economic development, and social changes that made the old arrangements unsustainable. The rigid social hierarchy that seemed divinely ordained and permanently fixed eventually gave way to more fluid and open societies. Third, technological and social progress isn't automatic or inevitable. It requires the accumulated efforts of countless individuals working to improve their circumstances and create better opportunities for their children. The comfortable, secure lives that many modern people enjoy were built on the foundation of centuries of human struggle, innovation, and gradual improvement. Understanding peasant history also provides important perspective on contemporary complaints and challenges. Yes, modern life has its stresses and difficulties, but they pale in comparison to the daily struggle for survival that defined peasant existence. Traffic jams, student loans, and slow Wi-Fi are genuine inconveniences, but they're nothing compared to wondering whether your family will have enough food to survive the winter. Still, the comparison between medieval and modern life isn't just about appreciating how much better things have gotten. Medieval peasant communities had some qualities that many modern societies have lost: strong social bonds, clear community identity, direct connection between work and survival, and cultural traditions that provided meaning and continuity across generations. Medieval peasants knew their neighbors intimately, could rely on community support during emergencies, and had skills and knowledge that made them largely self-sufficient. Their work, however difficult, provided direct and visible benefits to their families and communities. They lived embedded in seasonal rhythms and cultural traditions that connected them to their ancestors and their land. Of course, we wouldn't want to give up modern medicine, education, mobility, and individual freedom to recapture these elements of medieval peasant life. But understanding what we've gained and lost in the transition from pre-modern to modern societies can help us think more clearly about how to address contemporary social problems and build communities that combine modern advantages with human scale. Social connections. The story of medieval peasant life is ultimately a story about human resilience, adaptability, and the gradual progress toward more humane and equitable societies. These weren't perfect people living perfect lives. They were flawed humans, dealing with extraordinary challenges, using the limited resources available to them. They made mistakes, suffered defeats, and often failed to overcome the obstacles they faced. But they also achieved remarkable things. They fed the populations that built medieval civilization, preserved cultural traditions through centuries of upheaval, developed agricultural and craft techniques that supported economic growth, and gradually created the social and economic foundations for the more complex societies that followed. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that ordinary people facing extraordinary hardships can maintain their humanity, create meaning in difficult circumstances, and work toward better futures for their children. The medieval peasant family struggling to survive another winter had more in common with modern families, facing economic uncertainty than either group might realize. Their story reminds us that progress isn't just about technological advancement or economic growth. It's about creating societies that provide more people with opportunities for security, dignity, and meaningful lives. The medieval peasants who couldn't read or write, who never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, who died without ever seeing the larger world beyond their village, were still human beings with hopes, dreams, fears, and loves that weren't fundamentally different from our own dot. So the next time you're frustrated with your commute, annoyed by your job, or worried about your financial future, remember the medieval peasant families who faced each day wondering if they'd have enough to eat, whether their children would survive to adulthood, and whether the next harvest would provide enough to carry them through another winter. Their struggles helped create the world we live in today, and their resilience reminds us of what humans can endure and overcome when they have to. That's the real lesson of medieval peasant life. Not that we should be grateful for whatever we have, but that we should appreciate both how far we've come and how much ordinary people can accomplish when they work together toward common goals, even under the most difficult circumstances.